Overview of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. The Peace Officer Bill of Rights, often referred to in various jurisdictions under slightly different names, such as the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, stands as a foundational legal framework designed to safeguard the procedural rights of law enforcement personnel during internal investigations and disciplinary proceedings. Originating with Maryland's enactment of a Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights in 1974, these statutory measures have since been adopted, expanded, and modified in multiple states across the United States. While the specific provisions vary by jurisdiction, the core premise remains consistent: to ensure that peace officers receive protections such as notice of allegations, access to representation, and due process before any punitive action is taken by their employing agencies. At its inception, POBR legislation aimed to prevent capricious or politically motivated discipline, thereby assuring police officers that their rights and careers would not be jeopardized without fair and structured oversight. By introducing formal investigative guidelines, limiting the conditions under which officers could be interrogated, and providing recourse against unfounded accusations, these bills sought to create a reliable framework of fairness. However, over time, critics and legal scholars have expressed growing concern regarding the practical implications of these protections. They argue that the procedural safeguards, though well-intentioned, can inadvertently hinder transparency, complicate the disclosure of critical evidence, and, in certain cases, obstruct criminal accountability. This critique is supported by analyses conducted by legal scholars and civil rights organizations, who suggest that POBR regimes may contribute to reduced evidentiary discovery and fewer trials, potentially insulating misconduct from scrutiny. As this expose unfolds, the text will delve into the historical trajectory of POBR, examine its state-by-state variations, and scrutinize the broader ramifications of these entrenched protections on the legal system. Through a methodical analysis of legislative texts, court rulings, academic research, and advocacy reports, this book will illuminate the complex interplay between officer rights and the fundamental imperatives of public accountability and justice. Historical context and rationale. The establishment of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, POBR, originating in the mid-1970s and subsequently adopted or adapted by various states, was not a historical accident. Instead, it arose from a confluence of social, political, and legal factors that culminated in an era increasingly attentive to the rights of not only citizens, but also those charged with enforcing the law. Understanding the historical context and rationale behind these statutes provides essential insight into their enduring influence on policing, accountability, and disciplinary procedures throughout the United States. The late 1960s and early 1970s in America were marked by widespread social unrest, amplified civil rights advocacy, and intense scrutiny of policing practices. High-profile incidents of police misconduct during the civil rights movement, combined with a heightened awareness of corruption and brutality, fueled demands for increased oversight and reform. In response, police unions, associations, and lobbying groups sought to secure greater procedural protections for their members. They argued that law enforcement officers, who often operated under extraordinary stress and life-threatening conditions, required safeguards against arbitrary discipline, political retaliation, and the trial by media phenomenon that often arose from incomplete or misleading narratives of an incident. Maryland's enactment of a Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights in 1974 is frequently regarded as the critical starting point for what would become the broader POBR framework. Policymakers and law enforcement representatives in Maryland recognized that the shifting public landscape, one that increasingly criticized police tactics, risked destabilizing the morale and credibility of the profession. By codifying procedural rights, Maryland statute sought to ensure that officers had the opportunity to defend themselves against allegations and that disciplinary proceedings would follow a standardized, legally sound process. This early measure provided a model for other states. The rationale behind its expansion was often twofold: to protect officers from unjust termination or public scapegoating, and to encourage more effective policing by assuring officers that their careers would not be jeopardized for conducting legitimate, if unpopular, enforcement activities. Political actors, facing pressure from powerful police unions and influenced by the public's complicated and often contradictory attitudes toward policing, found such protections to be a convenient means of maintaining a stable law enforcement presence. As police unions and collective bargaining gained increasing influence in the 1970s and 1980s, the diffusion of POBR-like statutes became a logical extension of collective rights. Contract negotiations frequently leveraged these statutory protections as essential terms of employment. Moreover, the move toward greater legal formalization in policing, evident in the proliferation of department policies, standardized training, and accreditation processes, reinforced the acceptance of POBR. By embedding procedural justice within disciplinary frameworks, legislators and law enforcement leaders aimed to create an environment where officers felt supported, even as community members demanded higher standards of transparency and accountability. In essence, the historical rationale behind POBR legislation reflects an attempt to balance two sometimes competing imperatives: granting officers the fair treatment they claimed was essential for morale and retention, while assuring the public that discipline, when necessary, followed a legitimate, legally grounded pathway. Over time, however, critics have questioned whether these protections deliver the intended balance or instead contributed to an intricate shield of procedural barriers that inhibited transparency, impeded effective oversight, and complicated public trust. This tension, forged in the fires of a tumultuous period of American policing history, remains at the heart of the ongoing debate over POBR's legacy. Purpose and scope of the book. The purpose of this book is to provide a comprehensive, empirically grounded examination of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, POBR, and its multifaceted impact on the United States criminal justice landscape. The text aims to elucidate how and why a legislative construct, initially envisioned as a mechanism for protecting the procedural rights of law enforcement personnel, has grown to affect core elements of accountability, transparency, and fairness in policing. By offering both historical context and contemporary analysis, this volume seeks to serve as a resource for policymakers, legal practitioners, academics, journalists, and the broader public, anyone interested in understanding the intersections of law, police conduct, and the public interest. This book distinguishes itself by going beyond superficial treatments of POBR legislation. It moves systematically from the inception of such frameworks to their application and consequences over time. The scope is deliberately wide. It encompasses not just the most well-known jurisdictions, such as Maryland and California, but also states where POBR legislation may be less publicly scrutinized. The state-by-state analysis of these statutes, their interpretations by courts, and their variations in enforcement will highlight both common threads and jurisdiction-specific nuances. Russian Police Union Contracts, Duke Law Journal, 2017. Within that scope, particular attention is paid to the procedural intricacies that influence how internal investigations are conducted, the evidence that is disclosed or withheld in disciplinary proceedings, and the resulting effects on trials, plea bargains, and settlements. A central objective is to explore the implications of POBR provisions for evidentiary discovery and legal accountability. This book will not merely restate the statutory language or summarize administrative policies. It will detail how these measures effectively shape the contours of criminal and civil litigation involving law enforcement officers. By investigating the legal battles fought over disclosure requirements, the curtailment of oversight, and the systemic obfuscation of evidence, the text aims to demonstrate how these frameworks have contributed to a culture in which trials are often reduced in number and complexity. Through methodical examination of case law, scholarly research, and investigative reporting, this work endeavors to provide a dispassionate yet critical account of the forces shaping these developments. The book also situates POBR legislation within the broader context of labor relations, collective bargaining, and political influence. This includes an exploration of how police unions have leveraged POBR statutes to negotiate for stronger safeguards, thereby intertwining labor rights with criminal justice policy. The resulting interplay between employment protections and public accountability invites pressing questions about the balance of interests, questions this text will confront with rigor and impartiality. Lastly, the scope of the book extends to considering possible pathways for reform. While not an advocacy document per se, the concluding sections will critically examine efforts to recalibrate these legal frameworks. Drawing on ongoing legislative discussions, proposed reforms, and public pressure campaigns, it will consider how states and municipalities might realign their policies to ensure that procedural fairness for officers does not come at the expense of transparency, justice, or public trust. In doing so, this work aspires to contribute to a more informed, empirically supported debate on how best to reconcile the legitimate rights of peace officers with the overarching principles of accountability, fairness, and societal well-being.